There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has no name. It doesn't come from overworking or heartbreak. It comes from the moment you finally notice a pattern you've been ignoring for years. Every time you needed something, not much, just presence, just someone to match what you gave, you found yourself alone in a way that nobody around you seemed to acknowledge. And the disturbing part isn't that it happened once, it's that it happened enough times to start changing how you see people. Not with bitterness, with clarity. This video is about what Jung called the shadow of abandonment, the unconscious belief most people carry that someone is eventually coming to rescue them from their own mind. And more importantly, what becomes possible the moment that belief finally breaks. You didn't burn out from giving too much. You burned out from the quiet, absolute certainty that your giving was the only thing keeping them around. That sentence either meant nothing to you or it just disassembled something you have been carrying for a very long time. If it's the latter, stay here. Because what follows is not comfort. It is a map of the architecture beneath the exhaustion you cannot name. And once you see the architecture clearly, the exhaustion transforms into something else entirely. Imagine you have just helped a friend through a 6-month crisis. Every 2 a.m. text answered. Every panic attack absorbed into your own nervous system and processed into something manageable for them. Every canceled plan rescheduled without complaint because they needed you and you were there, the way you have always been there, the way you assumed someone would eventually be there for you. Then, 2 weeks after they stabilize, 2 weeks after they find someone new or simply feel better, they stop responding. Your messages go unanswered, not with hostility, with something worse, indifference. You are suddenly sitting in a deafening silence that nobody around you seems to register as unusual, because to them, the transaction is complete. They received what they needed. The arrangement has concluded, and you are left holding the receipt for a debt that was never acknowledged. This video is going to trace the exact architecture of that silence. We will uncover the illusion that kept you trapped inside it, the terrifying moment you begin seeing the pattern with full clarity, and finally, the profound liberation that waits on the other side of the realization that nobody is coming. The first thing you need to understand is that the silence was never random. It has a structure, and the structure was built long before you were old enough to recognize it. You assume people leave because you weren't good enough, because you failed some invisible test of worthiness, because if you had been slightly more lovable, slightly more interesting, slightly less needy in the one moment you allowed yourself to need anything at all, they would have stayed. This is the story your mind tells because it is less terrifying than the alternative. The alternative is this: human connection in the unconscious collective is largely conditional, not universally, not without exception, but far more often than any of us were taught to believe. You are loved for your utility. You are kept for your function. And the moment your function ceases to serve, the connection dissolves. Not because the other person is cruel, but because the connection was never between two people. It was between one person and the role you performed for them. Jung warned about this with a precision that still cuts. He wrote that through the persona, a man tries to appear as this or that, but the danger is that they become identical with their personas. You built a mask, not consciously, not with malice or strategy. You built it because survival demanded it. As a child, you learned that being agreeable kept you safe, that emotional availability purchased proximity to love, that absorbing the moods of the room protected you from the consequences of someone else's instability, and you carried this into every relationship of your adult life. You became the one who listens, the one who understands, the one who never makes it about themselves, the one whose needs are so invisible that people forget they exist. You became a highly functional emotional sponge, and deep beneath the surface of your generosity, so far below conscious awareness that you could not have named it if asked, a secret calculation was running. If I save enough people, eventually someone will turn around and save me. This is what Jung identified as the rescue fantasy. not a conscious belief, a shadow operation, an infantile pattern inherited from the earliest moments of your development when survival depended on a larger being arriving to meet your needs. The infant screams and the mother comes. The child falls and someone lifts them. This is how the psyche learns that distress will be met. That suffering is a signal, that if you demonstrate your pain clearly enough, visibly enough, someone will respond. But somewhere in your history, the response stopped coming. Perhaps it came inconsistently, which is almost worse. The intermittent reinforcement taught your nervous system that rescue was possible but unpredictable, which meant you could never stop signaling, never stop performing your distress or your worthiness, because the next attempt might be the one that finally worked. You became addicted to hope the way a gambler is addicted to the next pull of the lever. Not because it usually pays, because it occasionally does. And that occasional validation was enough to keep you invested in a system that was bankrupting you. Instead of grieving that loss, instead of metabolizing the abandonment and integrating it, your psyche did something far more creative and far more dangerous. It built a strategy. It decided that if distress alone would not summon the rescuer, then usefulness might, service might, becoming indispensable might. And so you learned to earn love through labor. Not physical labor, emotional labor, the invisible, uncredited work of holding the room together. You stay loyal through someone's absolute chaos, defending them when no one else will, showing up at hours that cost you sleep you will never recover, absorbing criticisms you did not earn and processing them into understanding rather than anger. And then one day you look up and realize that loyalty was never mutual. You were a resource, not a person. And the moment you see this, something fundamental in your perception shifts. This is the beginning of the seeing, and it changes everything. Awareness is a disruption. It does not arrive gently, and it does not leave anything untouched. Once you begin to perceive the conditional architecture of your connections, you cannot stop perceiving it. Every relationship becomes transparent. You start noticing who calls only when they need something, who disappears the moment you stop initiating, who fills the air with stories of their own life and never once pauses to ask about yours. You notice the precise mathematics of reciprocity, how lopsided every equation has always been, and you realize that the imbalance was not an accident, it was the design. And the escalation does not stop with observation. Awareness compounds. First, you see the dynamic in your closest relationships. Then you see it in acquaintances, then in colleagues, then in the structure of every social exchange you have participated in for your entire adult life. The lens, once activated, cannot be deactivated. It simply sharpens. Each day brings a new recognition, a new memory reinterpreted, a new moment from your past that suddenly rearranges itself from evidence of your lovability into evidence of your utility. You remember the friend who called you their rock. You realize now that rocks do not get watered. Rocks do not get sunlight. Rocks exist to be stood upon. And the language people used to praise you was never the language of love. It was the language of function. People are not actively malicious. That would almost be easier. Malice can be confronted. What you are dealing with is something quieter and more pervasive. People are simply entirely consumed by their own unconscious patterns. They are sleepwalking through their connections the same way you were sleepwalking through yours. The difference is that you have woken up, and they have not. If you've been the person who listens to everyone's pain and then found silence when you spoke, you know exactly what this realization costs. You know the specific weight of sitting in a room full of people who consider you essential and feeling more alone than you have ever felt in solitude. Because the loneliness of being unseen in a crowd is a different species of isolation than being alone in a quiet room. The room at least has no pretense. The crowd lies to your face. And then the deeper question arrives, the one your psyche has been protecting you from since the beginning of this unraveling. Who are you without the roles you perform? If you stop being the fixer, the mediator, the infinite well of patience, the person everyone calls at their worst and forgets at their best. If you simply stop, what remains? The phone stops ringing, the invitations thin. The people who swore you were irreplaceable find replacements with an efficiency that would be impressive if it weren't so clarifying. And you are left standing in the wreckage of an identity that was never yours to begin with. It was theirs, built to their specifications, maintained at your expense. And now that you have stopped maintaining it, you can see that what you mourned as connection was actually just a maintenance agreement. You test it. You stop initiating with one person, just one. Someone you always texted first, someone whose presence in your life you maintained through sheer gravitational effort. You step back and you wait. Days pass, a week, 2 weeks. The silence is absolute, and in that silence, you receive the answer you were always afraid to ask for. The answer is that without your effort, the connection does not exist. It never did. What you experienced as a relationship was actually a one-directional supply line that you mistook for a bridge, because traffic occasionally moved in both directions when they needed something. You hit a terrifying plateau, a place where seeing clearly isolates you further with every new perception. You cannot unsee the transactions. You cannot return to the comfortable blindness that made proximity to others bearable. You are lonely in crowded rooms. You are exhausted by conversations that never go beneath the surface. You are starving in a world full of people who call themselves your friends and have never once asked you a question they genuinely wanted the answer to. Jung named this isolation precisely. He wrote that the development of personality is at once a charisma and a curse, because its first fruit is the conscious and unavoidable segregation of the single individual from the undifferentiated and unconscious herd. You are being segregated, not as punishment, as consequence. The herd does not celebrate when one of its members wakes up. It does not applaud your clarity. It experiences your consciousness as a disruption to the collective sleep. Now comes the part that most people avoid. The part where the gaze turns inward and the comfortable story of your own goodness begins to fracture. Jung teaches that the shadow is not only the darkness we refuse to acknowledge in others, it is the darkness we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. And if you have spent years, possibly decades, building an identity around your capacity for selfless giving, the shadow waiting beneath that identity is going to be deeply uncomfortable to face. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Your endless giving was not pure altruism. Some of it was genuine. Some of it emerged from real compassion, from an authentic desire to ease suffering where you encountered it. But beneath the genuine compassion, woven through it like a thread you cannot remove without unraveling the whole garment, was a covert contract. You gave in order to create a debt. You gave in order to become indispensable. You gave because generosity was the only currency your psyche trusted to purchase the love it could not ask for directly. You needed validation to prove your right to exist, not your right to be celebrated or admired, something more fundamental than that. Your right to take up space, your right to have needs, your right to exist as something other than a function. And because you could not grant yourself that right, because something in your history stripped you of the belief that your existence alone was sufficient justification for your existence, you outsourced that validation to the people around you. You made them responsible for a debt they never agreed to carry, and then you resented them for not paying it. Your deepest attachments were not what you believed them to be. They were repair attempts, desperate, unconscious efforts to recreate the original scene of your wounding and achieve a different outcome. You chose people who could not see you because being unseen was the wound, and you believed, without ever articulating it, that if you could just make one of these unseen people finally see you, the original wound would heal. That the recognition you failed to receive as a child would arrive, retroactively, through the love of someone who resembled the person who first denied it to you. Look at the pattern honestly now. The partner who could never quite give you what you needed but kept you close enough to hope. The friend who saw your competence but never your pain. The parent whose approval you spent decades earning through performance, each one a different face on the same wound. Each one selected unconsciously but precisely because they replicated the original absence. You were not unlucky in love. You were accurate in your targeting. Your psyche found exactly the people who would confirm its deepest belief that you must earn your right to be seen, and installed them at the center of your life. But people cannot heal what they did not break, and the recognition you needed was never available from the outside. It was always an inside operation, a task only you could complete. And the reason it remained incomplete for so long is because completing it required you to do the one thing your entire psychological structure was designed to prevent. It required you to stop waiting. You stand at the exact threshold of your own life. You can retreat into the bitter comfort of the victim, or you can step into the terrifying, absolute sovereignty of the awake. The bitter person uses awareness as a weapon. They see through the motivations of everyone around them and use that clarity to justify permanent cynicism. They become the one who knows how people really are, and that knowledge becomes their fortress, their excuse, their permission to never risk anything again. They are technically correct about the world, and they are functionally dead inside it. The conscious person uses awareness as a scalpel. They see the same patterns. They perceive the same conditional architecture. They understand the same uncomfortable truths about human connection. But they choose engagement anyway, differently, without delusion, without the covert contracts, without the rescue fantasy. They connect knowing the risk. They give knowing that the giving itself is the point, not the reciprocation. They love without requiring the love to function as proof that they deserve to be alive. Both paths begin with the same realization. Only one of them leads somewhere you can breathe. Choosing awareness requires you to accept your own complicity in the illusion. It asks you to drop the covert contracts permanently, to release the people you held hostage to a debt they never signed, to accept the brutal, beautiful reality that you are the only one responsible for your survival, that no one is coming, that the rescue fantasy was always a ghost, and that the ghost was keeping you imprisoned in the doorway of your own life, waiting for permission to enter. Nobody is coming to save you from yourself. But the breathtaking inverse of this realization is that nobody is stopping you either. You no longer adjust your frequency to match their static. You let the dead silence hang in the air, and for the first time, you don't rush in to fill it with apologies. Before this realization, you waited by the phone. You softened your tone before you even knew what you wanted to say, preemptively dulling your own edges so no one would have reason to leave. You abandoned your own preferences to keep the room comfortable. You rehearsed conversations in advance, not to communicate clearly, but to minimize the chance that your honesty would cost you proximity to someone who was never really close. You maintained a fragile, anxious warmth that required constant tending, constant vigilance against the possibility that you might accidentally reveal a need and shatter the illusion of your self-sufficiency. After the realization, something different takes root. You stop performing. You let the uncomfortable silence stretch without rushing to rescue anyone from it. You allow people to be disappointed in you and discover that their disappointment does not kill you the way you always believed it would. You say no, and the sky does not fall. You express a need, and the earth does not open beneath your feet. Someone asks you to take on something you do not want, something that would have been automatic before. The old you would have said yes before the sentence was finished, would have felt the familiar tightening in your chest as you sacrificed another piece of your time, your energy, your increasingly depleted reserves for the comfort of someone who would not remember your sacrifice by next week. But now you pause, and in that pause, something extraordinary happens. You feel your own preferences, clearly, without guilt, without the instinctive override that used to scramble the signal before it reached your conscious mind. You feel what you actually want, and you say it. The room shifts. The person's face registers something between confusion and offense. They are not accustomed to hearing you refuse. They did not know you were capable of it. And in their surprise, you can read the entire history of your dynamic with them. They never saw you as a person who might say no. They saw you as a person who always said yes. And those are not the same thing. You discover slowly, with something between grief and wonder, that the catastrophe you spent your whole life preventing was never going to happen. The exile you feared was already your reality. You were already alone in the way that mattered. The only thing that changed is that now you are alone honestly, without the performance, without the mask, without the exhausting fiction that proximity equals connection. Your fragile, anxious confidence is replaced by something heavier, quieter, a stability that does not depend on anyone's approval because it was not built from anyone's approval. It was built from the wreckage of every illusion you were brave enough to let die. Loneliness no longer feels like punishment. It feels like clarity, a place where illusions go to die. You notice that the people who remain in your life after this shift are different. Not necessarily new people, sometimes the same people, but now you can see them clearly enough to know who was always genuine and who was simply well-positioned in the arrangement. The connections that survive the collapse of your persona are the ones that were never built on it. They are fewer, they are quieter, and they are more real than anything you experienced in 30 years of performing availability. You begin to understand that the quantity of connection you maintained before was itself a symptom. The constant buzzing of social obligation, the full calendar, the reputation for being someone everyone could count on. It was noise, beautiful, flattering noise designed to drown out the signal your psyche was trying to send, that you were profoundly, structurally alone in the ways that actually mattered. And all the busyness of your social life was just set dressing on an empty stage. Solitude transforms from exile into an acoustic chamber of truth. A place where you can finally hear your own voice without it being drowned out by the constant static of other people's needs, other people's opinions, other people's projections about who you were supposed to be. And in that quiet, you discover something remarkable. The voice was always there, speaking clearly, telling you exactly what you needed. You simply could not hear it over the noise of your own desperate performance. You stop searching for the person who will finally understand you completely. Not because you have given up on being understood, but because you realize that the need to be fully understood by another human being was itself a remnant of the rescue fantasy. It was the belief that somewhere, someone existed who could witness the entirety of what you carry and thereby relieve you of the weight. But the weight is not a burden to be transferred. It is your substance. It is what gives you gravity in a world full of people who float from surface to surface without ever landing anywhere real. The goal of this inner work was never to achieve a state of permanent comfort or unbroken companionship. Jung knew that. He knew the point was never arriving at some final destination where the work is finished and the loneliness is cured. The point was consciousness itself. The ability to see clearly, to choose deliberately, to carry yourself through your own life without outsourcing the weight to people who never agreed to hold it. The shadow of abandonment does not dissolve when someone finally arrives to rescue you. It dissolves when you realize the person you were waiting for was always yourself. Not in the shallow, motivational sense of self-love that decorates journal covers and inspirational posts. In the structural sense, in the sense that the seat you kept empty at the table of your own life, the chair you reserved for the person who would finally arrive and validate your existence, was always meant for you. You were standing at the door of your own house, waiting for permission to enter, and the permission was never anyone else's to grant. The question worth sitting with, and what I'd ask you to share below if this reached something real in you, is this. When did you first feel that silence, and what did you do with it? Jung-based boundary drills, perception training for empaths, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. 236 pages. Downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com.